My name is Bernadette Osei. I am 43 years old. On a Tuesday morning in April, 3 years ago, two Child Protective Services investigators knocked on my front door at 8:47 in the morning. I know the time precisely because I looked at the clock on the microwave when I heard the knock, the specific reflex of someone who has spent 12 years arriving at front doors at specific times, and understanding that the time of an arrival communicates something about the nature of the visit. 8:47 is a morning visit. Morning visits are typically initiated by a report received the previous day or evening, processed through the overnight intake system, assigned to investigators for early morning follow-up. Morning visits are almost never emergency visits, which would happen earlier, often before 7. 8:47 means someone filed a report, and the report was assessed as requiring prompt, but not emergency follow-up, a medium priority assessment. I understood all of this before I opened the door. I opened the door. The two investigators were a man and a woman. The woman was approximately 30, with the specific quality of someone in her first 2 or 3 years in the field, attentive and professionally composed, but carrying the particular slight tension of someone who has not yet fully metabolized the specific emotional demands of the work. The man was perhaps 40, with the specific composed manner of someone who has been doing this for a decade and who has learned to be present without being reactive. I looked at them for a moment. I said, "Good morning. I'm Bernadette Osei. I was a CPS caseworker in Cobb County for 12 years. I want you to know that before we begin, because I think it's relevant to how we conduct this conversation, I'll be happy to cooperate fully with the investigation, and I'd like to know the nature of the report." The woman looked at the man looked at me with the specific expression of someone reassessing a situation they had expected to be different. He said, "Ms. Osei, we received a report regarding your children." I said, "I understand. Would you like to come in?" What happened across the following weeks was the specific thing that happens when someone files a false or substantially exaggerated report with Child Protective Services against someone who understands the CPS system with 12 years of professional intimacy from the inside, from the caseworker's side of the front door. Before I tell you what happened, let me take you back to the beginning, not the Tuesday morning. The specific beginning where the dynamic that produced the Tuesday morning report began, and where I first understood what kind of family I had married into, and what it was eventually going to require of me. I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, the oldest of 4 children born to Emmanuel and Grace Osei, who had come to the United States from Ghana in 1976, with the specific combination of credentials and determination that the immigration of their generation required in abundance. My father held a doctorate in civil engineering from the University of Ghana and spent 31 years in transportation infrastructure planning for the state of Georgia, the work of someone who understood that the built environment of a place shaped the lives of everyone who lived in it, and who brought that understanding to his work across decades of the specific patient application of expertise to public problems. My mother was a nurse who spent her American career in the Grady Health System, eventually as a nurse manager in the pediatric unit, the particular combination of technical skill and specific human warmth that pediatric nursing requires in abundance. She raised 4 children while working full-time with the particular combination of efficiency and love that I have always understood as the specific inheritance she passed to all of us. The understanding that care and competence were not intention, but were the same thing expressed in different registers. I was the oldest and the most specifically oriented toward the human dimension of public systems, the particular question of what institutions did to people, and what happened at the point of contact between a person in need and the specific institution that was supposed to address that need. This orientation came partly from watching my mother in the pediatric unit and partly from something more specific that I want to describe because it is directly relevant to why I chose the work I chose. When I was 9 years old, a family on our street had a Child Protective Services investigation. The family's name was Miller, and they were the specific family on the street that other families worried about. The family whose house sometimes had evidence of difficulty visible from the outside. The family whose children came to school sometimes with the particular quality of children who have not had the full night's sleep or the full breakfast that children need. The investigation resulted in the 3 Miller children being temporarily removed from the home, and I watched this from my front porch and understood, with the particular perceptiveness of a 9-year-old who has been raised by parents who discuss the world seriously at the dinner table, that something significant had happened to those children, and that something significant had happened to their parents, and that the institution that had caused both things to happen was doing something that was trying to be right, and that might be right, and that required the particular kind of human judgment that was the most difficult thing to get right about any complex public system. I went back to that memory many times across my career. The Miller children and the specific question of what the institution that intervened in their lives was getting right, and what it was getting wrong, and what it would have needed to get it more right. The question drove 12 years of casework, and eventually the specific expertise I brought to the Tuesday morning in April when 2 investigators were at my door. I went to Georgia State for social work. I worked as a CPS caseworker in Cobb County for 12 years, the specific demanding work of the front line of a system that is responsible for some of the most significant decisions a public institution makes about private family life. I worked family maintenance cases and family reunification cases and cases that resulted in termination of parental rights. I supervised the specific investigations that people reported, and the ones that people should have reported earlier, and the ones that should not have been reported at all. I understood, with the specific depth of 12 years of daily practice, how the system worked from the inside. I left casework at 33 to move to the policy side of child welfare, a position at a nonprofit that conducted research and advocacy on child welfare systems across Georgia. The work of someone who had enough experience with the operational reality of the system to understand what policy changes would actually change in practice, rather than only on paper. I had been in that role for 7 years when the investigators knocked on my door. I met my husband David at a child welfare policy conference in Atlanta when I was 31. He was 34, working as a pediatric social worker in a hospital system, the specific intersection of our professional worlds that produced an immediate recognition of shared values and shared vocabulary. We dated for 2 years and married when I was 33, the year I left casework, and we built the specific life that 2 people build when they are both committed to demanding work they believe in, and when they are also trying to build a family alongside that work. We have 2 daughters, Imani, who is 8, and Zora, who is 5. They were 7 and 4 at the time of the Tuesday morning visit. David's family is from Augusta. His parents, Walter and Dorothy Kessington, had retired to a smaller house in Augusta's historic district after David's father retired from 30 years as a high school principal. They were warm people who welcomed me with the specific, genuine warmth of people whose welcome did not require anything of me except that I was someone David loved. David's sister, Lynette, was a different matter. I want to describe Lynette Kessington carefully because I think accuracy serves this story more than simplification, and the accuracy requires acknowledging that Lynette was not a simple villain in the specific way that simple villains operate. She was a person with a specific history and specific wounds and specific needs that had not been adequately addressed, who responded to a particular anxiety about her position in her family by doing something that was seriously wrong and that could have been seriously harmful, and who did it not from pure malice but from the specific combination of genuine distress and genuinely poor judgment that produces some of the worst decisions that genuinely distressed people make. Lynette was 38 at the time of the report. She was David's younger sister by 4 years, a middle school art teacher in Augusta, married to a man named Carl who worked in insurance, the mother of 1 child, a 10-year-old son named Tyler, who had been, across his entire childhood, the specific center of Dorothy and Walter's grandparental attention, in the way that only children and oldest grandchildren sometimes become the center of grandparental attention. When David and I married and when Imani and then Zora arrived, something shifted in the Kessington family dynamics in the specific way that shifts happen when a family's established patterns of attention and affection are reorganized by new members and new relationships. Dorothy and Walter loved their granddaughters. Their loving them did not reduce their love for Tyler, who remained their first grandchild and their only grandson. But the specific quality of attention reorganized, as it naturally does, and Lynette experienced this reorganization in a way that I believe she experienced as loss rather than expansion, a reduction of something precious rather than an addition to something already good. I want to be precise about what this looked like in practice, because precision matters here, and because I do not want to characterize what happened as simple jealousy, which would be both inaccurate and insufficient. Lynette had a specific and long-standing relationship with Dorothy, a closeness that had developed across Lynette's childhood and that had particular intensity. I came to understand from David's careful but honest description of the family history, because Lynette had gone through a difficult period in her early 20s, a relationship that ended badly and a professional setback and a period of genuine difficulty, and Dorothy had been the primary support during that period, and the relationship between them had the specific quality of intimacy that sometimes develops from having been present during someone's hardest years. When David and I married and built our lives in Atlanta rather than Augusta, Dorothy's attention necessarily moved in some ways toward us, toward the grandchildren who were closer geographically and who were young, and who required the specific forms of grandparental support that young children require. This was not a choice to diminish Lynette. It was the natural geography of relationship, but it landed on Lynette, given her history and her particular relationship to her mother, as something that felt specifically like displacement. She did not say this to David or to me directly. What she did was the specific thing that Lynette did when something felt wrong in the family, which was to address it through the management of information and the specific cultivation of certain perceptions among the family members whose perceptions mattered to her most. What she managed, across the 2 years before the Tuesday morning, was a narrative about me and my parenting that she cultivated specifically with Dorothy, using the particular access she had to Dorothy's attention and the specific trust that 38 years of mother-daughter relationship produced. I want to describe what I knew of this and when I knew it, because the knowing matters to the story. I knew that Lynette was less warm to me than to David. This had been true from the beginning of our relationship, and I had attributed it, in the early years, to the normal adjustment of a sibling encountering their brother's serious partner. I knew that she occasionally made comments to Dorothy, relayed to David, who relayed versions of them to me with the specific, careful editing of someone trying to relay information without escalating conflict, that suggested she found my parenting style concerning in ways she did not specify directly. I knew that at a family gathering in August, 18 months before the Tuesday morning, she had said something to Dorothy about Imani's behavior that had prompted Dorothy to ask David, in a separate conversation, whether everything was all right at home. I knew from a conversation David had with Carl at a family Christmas gathering 6 months before the Tuesday morning that Lynette had been saying things about me to people in the family that Carl found himself in the uncomfortable position of knowing about, and that he had communicated to David in the specific way of a spouse communicating concern about their partner's behavior to someone who can potentially do something about it. I had said to David, after the Christmas conversation, that I thought someone needed to address whatever Lynette was saying directly, because indirect communication through family channels was not going to resolve whatever was actually driving her behavior. David had said he would talk to her. He talked to her in February. I was not present for the conversation. He described it to me afterward as a conversation in which Lynette had become defensive, and had said that she was simply expressing concerns she had, and that if David had a problem with her expressing concerns, she could express them to whoever needed to hear them. I had said, "What did she mean by that?" David had said, "I don't know. I told her that if she had specific concerns about the girls, she should talk to us directly. I had said, "Did she say she would?" He had said, "She didn't say anything after that." The Tuesday morning came 6 weeks after the February conversation. I opened the door and invited the investigators in. We sat in the living room. Imani was at school. Zora was in the kitchen finishing her breakfast. The male investigator, whose name I later learned was Marcus Williams, and the female investigator, whose name was Jennifer Park, sat on the couch. I sat across from them. Marcus said, "Ms. Osei, we received a report yesterday evening that raised concerns about the welfare of your children. I want to be transparent with you about the process. We're here to conduct a face-to-face assessment, which is standard when we receive a report of this nature." I said, "What specifically was reported?" He said, "The report described concerns about a child being left alone, inadequate supervision, and an incident involving physical harm to a child." I said, "I understand. I want to tell you how I'd like to handle this conversation, and I want to explain my reasoning so you understand it's coming from a place of cooperation rather than resistance." They were both listening. I said, "I worked as a CPS caseworker in Cobb County for 12 years. I've been on your side of this conversation hundreds of times. I know the protocol and I know what you need, and I'm going to give you everything you need. What I'd also like is to understand the specific allegations so I can respond to them specifically rather than generally, because general denials aren't useful to you and they're not useful to me." Marcus said, "You were a CPS caseworker." I said, "Yes, 12 years, left to do policy work. I'm currently at the Georgia Child Welfare Research Institute." He and Jennifer exchanged a specific look. Not suspicious. The look of two people recalibrating their expectations of how a conversation is going to go. Marcus said, "The report described an incident approximately 2 weeks ago in which your daughter Zora was left alone in the house for an extended period. It also described a physical altercation between you and one of your children." I said, "Those are specific allegations. I want to respond to each one specifically." I said, 2 weeks ago was a Thursday. I was home with both girls for the entire day. David worked from home that Thursday as well because his office had a plumbing issue. I can give you David's office's contact information and his supervisor's name if you want to verify that his office had a closure that week. I said, "Regarding any physical altercation with either of my daughters, that has not occurred. I would like to understand the specific description of this alleged incident because specificity will help me help you understand what actually happened or what might have been observed and misinterpreted." Marcus said, "The report described you striking one of your children in a disciplinary context." I said, "That has not occurred. I want to be specific about what discipline in our household looks like, because I think the specificity will be useful. We use timeout and privilege removal as primary discipline strategies. We have never struck either of our daughters. Both daughters see their pediatrician regularly, and both have had well child visits within the last 4 months. I have those records, and I'm happy to authorize their release to your office." Jennifer said, "Ms. Osei, would you be comfortable with us speaking to your daughters separately?" I said, "Yes. Zora is in the kitchen. I'll bring her in. Imani is at school. You're welcome to go to the school to speak with her there, and I'll let the school know to expect you. I'd also like to be transparent about something." They both waited. I said, "I believe I know who filed this report. I want to tell you that because I think you should have the full context. I'm not saying this to prejudice your investigation. I'm saying it because the circumstances of the report are going to be relevant to how you assess its credibility." Marcus said, "Who do you believe filed the report?" I said, "My husband's sister, Lynette Kessington." I want to describe the family context briefly so you understand why I believe this, and why I believe the report is false or substantially exaggerated. I describe the family context. The 2 years of escalating narrative, the February conversation between David and Lynette, the specific statement she had made about expressing concerns to whoever needed to hear them. Marcus took notes. Jennifer also took notes. When I finished, Marcus said, "Ms. Osei, I want to be honest with you about something." I said, "Please." He said, "The specific details in this report are going to be something we assess carefully, particularly in light of what you've told us about the family context. Reports filed in the context of family conflict are a specific category that requires careful evaluation." I said, "I know. I've assessed hundreds of them." He said, "Yes, which you've told us." He said, "I'd like to see your home and speak with Zora and verify the contact information you've mentioned for your husband's office." I said, "Of course. Let me stop here for a moment because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where the thing that was supposed to be used against you was the very thing you understood most completely? Where the weapon someone chose was the specific domain in which you had 12 years of expertise, and where that expertise was the specific thing that determined what happened next?" Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Because what happened across the following 3 weeks is the specific thing I want you to understand before I tell you about the investigation's conclusion. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. The investigators spent 45 minutes in our home that Tuesday morning. They spoke with Zora for approximately 20 minutes in the kitchen, with the specific child-appropriate approach that CPS investigators are trained to use, sitting at her level and using simple language and asking open-ended questions. I know what those questions look like from the inside because I have asked them hundreds of times. I know what answers suggest genuine distress and what answers suggest a happy child being asked about things she has no particular feelings about. Marcus and Jennifer did not tell me what Zora said. They were not required to, and the specific professional practice of CPS investigations does not include giving parents a running account of child interviews, for the specific good reason that the child's account should be independent of the parent's knowledge of it. I accepted this the way I had always expected parents to accept it, which was with the specific understanding that the process was doing what it was supposed to do. They toured the house. They asked about the layout, about where the children slept, about the specific arrangements for Zora's care during the day when David and I were both working. I answered specifically. Our child care provider, whose name is Addis and who has been with us for 3 years, comes Monday through Thursday from 8 to 5:30. Friday I work from home. David has scheduling flexibility in his hospital social work role and manages to be home before 6 most evenings. They asked for contact information. Adisi's number, David's supervisor's number, the pediatrician's office, the school. I gave them all of it. I also gave them something they did not ask for, because 12 years in this system had taught me what the investigation was going to need, and I was going to provide it whether asked or not. I gave them a brief written account, prepared while they were speaking with Zora, of the Thursday 2 weeks prior. The document described David's office closure, our day at home with the girls, the specific activities of that day, the places we had gone in the afternoon, and included the contact information for the coffee shop we had taken the girls to that afternoon where I was a regular and where the staff knew us. I gave them a written timeline of the family dynamic with Lynette, organized chronologically with specific dates and specific events, the 2 years of the escalating narrative, the February conversation, the specific statement about expressing concerns to whoever needed to hear them. I had prepared this document in the 90 minutes between learning what David understood from the Christmas conversation and the present moment, because I had known, from the moment of that Christmas conversation, that the specific trajectory we were on was going to require documentation, and that documentation was most useful when it was contemporaneous rather than retrospective. Marcus took the documents. He looked at them with the specific expression of an experienced investigator encountering a level of preparation that exceeded his expectations. He said, "You prepared these before we arrived." I said, "The timeline, yes. I've been keeping it since December." The account of Thursday I prepared while you were speaking with Zora. He said, "Why the timeline since December?" I said, "Because the conversation in December told me the situation was progressing in a direction that might eventually require documentation, and I've spent 12 years understanding that documentation is most useful when it's created close in time to the events it documents rather than after the fact." He said, "You thought she might make a report?" I said, "I thought the situation had a trajectory that required me to be prepared." He said, "What made you think CPS specifically?" I said, "She said she would express her concerns to whoever needed to hear them, in the context of a conversation about my parenting. In the context of a 12-year history of understanding that CPS is one of the institutions people sometimes use in family conflicts. I thought it was a specific possibility I needed to be prepared for." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Miss Osei, I want to ask you something candidly." I said, "Please." He said, "Have you documented anything that would suggest your children are not safe in your home?" I said, "No. Specifically, no. My children are safe and healthy and loved, and I can give you names and contact information for every person in their regular lives who can confirm that, and I invite you to contact all of them." He said, "I intend to." He did. The investigation lasted 3 weeks and involved interviews with Imani at her school, which the school principal conducted with the CPS investigator present according to the protocol I knew from the inside, and which produced, from my 7-year-old daughter, the specific account of a happy child with no awareness of any home situation that required concern. It involved a call to David's supervisor confirming the office closure. It involved a conversation with a Days, who had been with our family for 3 years, and who described our household and our parenting with the specific calm confidence of someone who has daily detailed knowledge of what she is describing. It involved a conversation with our pediatrician's office. It also involved, I learned later from Marcus in a conversation he had with David toward the end of the investigation, a conversation with Lynette herself. I want to tell you about the specific thing that happened during the conversation with Lynette because it matters to the full shape of the story. Marcus Williams, who turned out to be a 14-year veteran of CPS investigations with the specific professional quality of someone who has done this work long enough to develop a thorough understanding of what different kinds of reports look like and why they are filed, spoke with Lynette by phone about the specific details of the report. In that conversation, Lynette described what she had reported. She described the Thursday incident of alleged unsupervised time for Zora. She described the alleged physical altercation. Marcus asked her specific questions. How did she know about the Thursday incident? What specifically had she observed or been told about the physical altercation? The specific answers Lynette gave to these specific questions were the specific answers that the investigation ultimately documented as inconsistent with the evidence collected from every other source. She had not been in Atlanta on the Thursday she described. She had not been in our home. What she described as having observed directly was information she had received secondhand from a source she described as a family member, which investigation established was Dorothy, who had mentioned to Lynette that she had been in Atlanta on that Thursday visiting the girls while David and I were home. Dorothy's account of that Thursday visit, when Marcus spoke with her, was an account of a pleasant afternoon with her granddaughters that did not include any of the elements Lynette had reported. The physical altercation allegation, when Marcus pressed for specific details, produced a description that Lynette said she had inferred from something Imani had said to Dorothy, which Dorothy had mentioned to Lynette, and which Dorothy, when asked directly about it, said she did not recall Imani saying, and that she believed Lynette might have misunderstood something else that was said in a different context. The investigation's finding, documented in the CPS system 3 weeks after the Tuesday morning, was that the report was unsubstantiated. Both allegations were assessed as lacking credible evidence and as inconsistent with all available corroborating information. The finding was also documented with a specific notation that the report appeared to have been made in the context of ongoing family conflict, and that the allegations were not corroborated by direct observation or any reliable secondary account, a notation that is part of the permanent CPS record, and that would be relevant if any future report from the same source was received. I want to be specific about what the notation means in practice, because I know exactly what it means from 12 years of reading similar notations in similar files. It means that the investigative record now contains documentation that a specific reporter made specific allegations that were not corroborated and that appeared to be filed in the context of family conflict. Future reports from this reporter would be reviewed in that context. Marcus Williams called me when the finding was documented. He said, "Ms. Osei, I wanted to let you know directly that the investigation is closed as unsubstantiated." I said, "Thank you for letting me know." He said, "I also want to say something off the record." I said, "Of course." He said, "The documentation you provided was the most comprehensive and well-organized information package I've received in an investigation in 14 years. Every piece of it checked out exactly as you'd described. The timeline in particular was something I don't see in situations like this." I said, "I spent 12 years on your side of the front door. I know what investigations need." He said, "Yes, you mentioned that." He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "In your 12 years, did you ever encounter a situation where the reporter was a family member and the report was filed in the context of family conflict?" I said, "Frequently." He said, "What was the typical outcome?" I said, "Typical outcome was unsubstantiated." Family conflict reports are a specific category. They're filed more often than the general public knows, and they're substantiated at a much lower rate than reports filed by mandatory reporters or community members without a family interest. He said, "That's consistent with our data." He said, "Ms. Osei, what would you have done if you hadn't had the documentation?" I sat with that question for a moment. I said, "The same investigation would have reached the same conclusion eventually, because the facts would have been the same, regardless of whether I had documented them in advance. But it might have taken longer, and it might have required more conversations. And there might have been moments where the he said, she said nature of it made things more difficult." He said, "The documentation moved things." I said, "Documentation always moves things in this system. That's why I kept it. I want to tell you about what happened with Lynette, because I think the honest telling of it is more useful than a version that cleans up the complexity." David spoke with Lynette after the investigation closed. This was the specific conversation that I was not present for because I had made the decision, after significant thought, that David needed to have this conversation with his sister without me there, because my presence would have made it about me and Lynette in a way that would have prevented what needed to happen, which was David telling his sister what she had done and what it had cost and what he understood about why. He came home from that conversation with the specific quality of someone who has been through something that was necessary and difficult, and that changed something in the way he was going to live in his family going forward. He said, "She said she was scared of losing us." I said, "She filed a CPS report because she was scared of losing you." He said, "She said it didn't feel real when she did it. She said it felt like the way you call a hotline when you're genuinely worried about something, not like something that would show up at your front door and start an investigation." I said, "She called a CPS hotline and described specific incidents. That is how the system works." He said, "I know. I told her that." He said, "She said she knew you were good parents. She said she knows the girls are fine." I said, "She said that after she filed a report describing me striking one of our daughters." He said, "Yes." He said, "I told her that." He said, "She cried. Not in the performing way, the real way." I said, "I believe she's genuinely sorry. I also believe she did something serious." He said, "Both of those things are true." I said, "What do you want to do about it?" He said, "I told her that what she did had consequences that extended beyond this family. That she used a system that is designed to protect children from genuine harm for a purpose that had nothing to do with my daughter's safety. And that if she had been reporting something real, the very behavior she engaged in, filing reports from a place of personal conflict rather than genuine concern, makes it harder for the system to take real reports seriously. I said, "You said that to her." He said, "Yes, because I needed her to understand that what she did had implications beyond our family." I said, "What did she say?" He said, "She said she knew. She said she had thought about that since the investigation started." He said, "She wants to talk to you." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you want to?" I sat with that question. I said, "Not yet. I need more time before that conversation is going to be useful to either of us." He said, "I understand." He said, "Delia, what do you need?" I looked at my husband, who had just had one of the most difficult conversations of his life with his sister, and who had had it in the way I would have wanted him to have it, specifically and honestly and without minimizing what had been done. I said, "I need to know this won't happen again." He said, "It won't." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because she knows now what it actually means. She didn't know before. She understood it as a complaint hotline. She understands now that she set a CPS investigation in motion against her nieces and her sister-in-law, and that there is now a permanent record in that system documenting what she did and why." I said, "Yes, there is." He said, "She's scared of that." I said, "She should be." I spoke with Lynette 8 months after the investigation closed. We had Thanksgiving at Walter and Dorothy's house, the first family gathering since the investigation, and the gathering had the specific quality of a room that contains something unresolved and that everyone present is managing around the unresolved thing without acknowledging it directly. After dinner, while David and Walter were doing the dishes and Dorothy had taken the girls to look at something in the garden, Lynette and I were alone in the living room for approximately 15 minutes. She said, "Bernadette, I want to say something to you." I said, "I'm listening." She said, "What I did was wrong in ways that I didn't understand when I did it. I didn't understand it the way I understand it now. I want you to know that understanding it is something I think about every day." I said, "Tell me what you understand now that you didn't understand then." She said, "I understand that CPS exists to protect children from genuine harm, and that using it for something else, even when you've convinced yourself you're actually worried, is a misuse of something serious. I understand that the people who investigate these reports are people who are doing demanding work to help children who actually need help, and that making them spend time on something that wasn't real takes that time away from something that might be." She said, "I understand that you had to open your door to investigators and answer questions about your children and allow them to interview your daughters. I understand what that costs someone to experience, and I put that cost on you without being able to justify it with anything true." I said, "Tell me why you did it." She was quiet for a long time. She said, "Because I was angry and I was scared, and I had a number I could call, and I thought calling it would do something that would make me feel like I had done something. I didn't think through what the something actually was." I said, "You called it because you were angry." She said, "Partly. And partly because some part of me had talked myself into believing there was a real concern. I had told myself enough stories about the kind of parent I thought you were, stories I had told Mom over 2 years, that some part of me had started to believe the stories." "That's the most honest thing I can tell you." I said, "You believed your own narrative." She said yes. I looked at Lynette Kessington, who was 38 years old and who had spent 2 years building a narrative about me that she had eventually reported to a government agency, and who was sitting across from me in her parents' living room 8 months later telling me, honestly and with the specific quality of genuine understanding rather than performed remorse, what she understood about what she had done. I said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as honestly as I'm saying it. She said, "Okay." I said, "I spent 12 years as a CPS caseworker. I have been in homes where children were genuinely in danger. I have removed children from situations where leaving them was not an option. I have also been in homes that were the subject of reports filed by people who were in conflict with the family, and I have conducted those investigations knowing that some part of the system's time and attention was being diverted from children who actually needed it toward a family dispute that needed something else entirely." I said, "When those two investigators came to my door, I knew what I was dealing with. I knew the process and I knew what to do, and I was able to cooperate fully and provide documentation that moved the investigation through quickly. Most parents in my position do not have that knowledge. Most parents in my position are frightened and do not know the process, and do not know that they can ask specific questions, and do not have documentation prepared. Most parents in my position experience what you initiated as something much more destabilizing than what I experienced." I said, "You are lucky that I was the person you filed against. If you had filed the same report against a family that did not have my background and my documentation, the outcome might have been the same, but the path to it would have been significantly harder for that family." She said, "I know." I said, "I want you to understand that beyond what it cost our family, not only the cost to us, the cost to the system and to the families who are its actual priority." She said, "I understand that." I said, "All right." She said, "Is there anything I can do?" I sat with that for a moment. I said, "I want your commitment, not to me, to my daughters. They are your nieces, and they love their Aunt Lynette, and they do not know what happened between us this year. What I want is for your relationship with them to be what it should have been all along, genuine and specific, and not organized around anything except the relationship itself." She said, "I can do that." I said, "I hope so. Because they deserve an aunt who is present in their lives because she loves them, not an aunt who is present in their lives because her presence is a form of management of something else." She said, "That's fair." I said, "I know." Dorothy came in from the garden with the girls a few minutes later. The conversation ended the way the specific conversations between two people who have been through something difficult end, not with resolution exactly, but with the particular quality of people who have said the necessary things and who are now in the specific awkward transition into normalcy that always follows necessary things. Imani ran to her Aunt Lynette and said something about something she had found in the garden. Lynette looked at her with the particular quality of someone receiving something genuinely, and I watched her receive it, and I understood what I was watching. Here is what a false CPS report filed by a family member and a 12-year career in child welfare and a banker's box of documentation taught me. I know that the systems designed to protect people are vulnerable to misuse in specific and well-documented ways, and that the misuse costs real people real things. Both the people against whom false reports are filed and the people who genuinely need the system and whose need is competing for resources with the misuse. I spent 12 years inside that system watching both things happen, and they are both real, and they do not cancel each other out. I know that documentation, built consistently and contemporaneously, is the specific form of protection available to people who understand that a situation is developing toward a point where documentation will matter. I started my timeline in December because December told me where things were going. The timeline did not prevent the Tuesday morning. It determined what happened after the Tuesday morning. I know that the specific expertise I had accumulated across 12 years of casework was the specific thing that determined how the investigation went. Not because I used it to manipulate the process, but because I understood the process completely and cooperated with it completely and provided everything the investigation needed in the format and specificity that the investigation could use. The expertise was not a weapon, it was a vocabulary. And I know that Lynette Kessington, sitting across from me at her parents' dining room table in November, told me something true about how people do the specific harm they do, which is that they tell themselves stories. Stories that accumulate and become internally consistent and that eventually feel like facts. And that the person most convinced of a false story is the person who has been telling it to themselves the longest. She told herself stories for 2 years. The stories became a report. The report became an investigation. The investigation found nothing because there was nothing to find, because the stories were stories. I do not think she is a bad person. I think she did something seriously wrong, and I think she understands it now in a way she did not understand it when she did it. Both things can be true. My daughters do not know what happened. They know their Aunt Lynette was not around for a while after last spring and that she is around again now. They have not asked why. Children often do not ask why when the why is complicated and when the adults around them have indicated, through the specific quality of their behavior, that the why is not something that currently needs to be explained. When they are old enough to understand it, I will tell them. Not as a lesson about Lynette, as a lesson about institutions, about what they are for and what they are sometimes used for, and about what you need to know about them to navigate them when you need to, whether from the inside or from the person at the front door being asked to let investigators in. That is my story. A knock at the door at 8:47 in the morning, 12 years of expertise on the other side of the door, a banker's box of documentation, and a finding in a permanent record that says what happened and why. If this reminded you of a moment when the thing someone tried to use against you was the specific thing you understood most completely, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that expertise, built honestly across years, is a form of protection that no one can take from you. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.